Okay, welcome to part 3 of the Blink tutorial series, and in this video we're going to wrap things up by creating all of the visual effects and shaders. So we're going to create all of the particle systems that are related to the blink, which means all of the swirly bits on the bottom, the spheres, the sort of connecting vortex in the middle, and we're also going to create the particle effects when you actually go to the location so that we have like this cool screen effect, a bit of post-process and a few other bits and pieces. So we've got a lot to cover. And if you haven't watched the first two parts of the series, I'll link them down below. The first part's where we do the fundamentals and sort of like the core functionality. The second part is where we add mantling support to the blink and actually refine the functionality of the gameplay so that it behaves a lot more consistently, especially when we're trying to get above areas. And as you know now, this is the third video where we talk about VFX. So welcome and let's dive in. So we will begin today's lesson by creating the sphere. We need a sphere for both the top and bottom of the effect, and I also need a sphere for the mantling. This is just to follow from how the game works. This is what it looks like in the game, as close as I could match it by just using simple textures that you'll have available. So most of the stuff here is things that you can create by yourself pretty easily, and I didn't want to make anything super crazy so that you wouldn't be able to recreate it yourself. There's a couple of bits here that, yeah, you won't have to hand, but obviously the project files are available below if you're interested in getting them. So let's talk about the sphere. That's the simplest thing that we're going to build today. Most of the shaders are fairly simple here. It's just a lot of tricks going on, and that's great. So as tech artists, we want to be able to build these kinds of shaders and really understand how they work. Cool, so let's begin. The first thing that I want to do is just to have a sphere in the level so that we can preview our effect. It's important to understand that when you're building things like shaders, you want to look at it in multiple sort of different lighting scenarios, and especially if your shader is lit, you should really consider how it looks in the preview, but really look at it how it looks in the world. All of these things matter. In our case, it's going to be an unlit material, so it should look fairly representative regardless of the time of day. So what we're going to do is I've made this little materials folder here, and we're going to build something from scratch. So we're going to make a new material, and before I do that, I'm just going to get the widget reflector up, and we're going to increase our interface size to 1.2. So there we go. Cool. Let's create the M blink sphere, and I'll just call it YT for YouTube because I already have one created, so we'll be able to start from there. The first thing that we need to do when we observe this effect is that especially when you look at the reference in the game, we've got this really nice swirling pattern, this kind of like vortex going on inside of the sphere. It looks really interesting, but in the game, you can see the edges of the sphere really nicely as well, which to me pointed to a Fresnel effect as well. So the first thing that we want to do is to grab a texture sample. So let's go ahead and grab a texture sample. And this texture sample, you can experiment. You can use whichever one you want, but what I'm going to use is one that, as far as I'm aware, comes with the engine called T-Noise01, which is right here. And you can see it says Engine Material Templates Textures. So it should be something that you have available. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a texture coordinate node so that we can mess with the tiling. So we can just find a texture coordinate node here, or hold U and click to get a texture coordinate node. We will delete this and connect it through. Now, obviously this won't do anything because we haven't changed any of the parameters, and all I'm going to do is tile these by 2. And whenever you're building shaders, if you're not familiar with how things are working, just start plugging them in and seeing what it is that they're doing. And that's going to be quite valuable for you. So first things first, what we want to do here is make sure that our surface is set to a few specific settings, right? So first thing is that this will be a translucent gray transmittance material so that we can get opacity overrides here. I'm going to leave it as lit for now so that we can see what we're doing. And what we can do is just start previewing this to get a better sense of how it is that this is going to work. The first thing I want to do is move this texture around. And in order to do that, we will need a panner node. Now, a pattern node will shift the UVs over time and will give us that movement onto the shader. So what we can do is feed it with time. So it's a fairly simple shader that we're building here, and we can decide which direction we'd like it to move in. So in this particular instance, I want it to go in the X direction for minus 0.7, and I'd like for it to go in the Y direction 0.5. So what I want is for this effect to move diagonally. I want it to sort of curl up on itself so that I have a little bit of movement in both axes. And that's what it looks like in this particular instance with the tiling all applied. Now, it is important for us that this effect has a color, right? So what we will do in this particular instance is just make a constant for our color. Now, it really depends what color you want to do. You can do whatever you want, but I'm going to do 0.25 in the red, so not a lot of red. I'm going to do 0.75 on the green, and then I'm going to do 1 in the blue because I want sort of like an aqua blue to match the effect. It's important to understand how these nodes work when you start playing around with them, right? So if we were to, for example, just multiply these together, what's going to happen here is that we're going to sample every single pixel on this texture, and every single pixel has a value from 0 to 1. So the pixels that are black, they're going to be 0 multiplied by this color. They won't do anything. But the ones that are white will start getting the color, and the ones that are gray will get the color a little bit less, so on and so forth. And that's how the multiply node works. Now, what you could do, for example, is, and in my particular case, this is what I would like to do, is I'd want to actually make this a little bit brighter. I don't want the texture to be so dark. Like there's a lot of black spots. And so what I want is for this to be more texture than it is black. So before we multiply by the color, I'm actually going to add 0.9 to this. So what that's going to do is, and this is a really nice thing to do, is what that's going to do is it's going to take every pixel that's like purely black and bring it almost to white. And everything that was white already is going to stay where it is. So I'm basically pulling all of the grays up. And that will give me this sort of a sphere, which, you know, it doesn't look like much to look at, but that's okay. Okay, so now we need to talk about the opacity and how that's going to work. Now, this is a very specific effect, and the way I'm doing it is by combining a couple of Fresnels with another moving texture, which I think you will find interesting. So for now, I'm actually going to put this into the emissive color, and we can talk about lit versus unlit a little bit later. Okay, so to build the transparency, get yourself a texture sample and pick the Voronoi perturbed 1K RGBA texture here that you can see. It is also, as far as I can understand, a engine texture that you have access to. Give it a texture coordinate node and mess with the tiling to sort of your desired choice. You can feed this into the opacity override and see what it does, okay? And what I'm trying to do here is that in the game, you can see a pattern on the sphere when you look really closely to it. I also think that they are applying this pattern to the normals. Now, that's not something that I want to do here in this video, but I just wanted to kind of show you why I started looking into this direction. The next thing that I want is a Fresnel. And the Fresnel will work by effectively masking out the center and making our edges more visible. So you can imagine as it's like a smooth gradient from 0 to 1 from the center of the object, where effectively where the camera is facing, and the edges will be closest to 1. If we reduce the exponent, we're sort of shrinking the range of that gradient, which is already giving us an interesting effect. Now, what I'd like to do is remap this with a smooth step. And when I say remap it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the Fresnel into the max. And what I'll do here is I'll show you what happens. Now, as the value here is 0, nothing is happening. But if I do something like 0.1, you can start to see a really interesting effect. Effectively, I'm using smooth step in a really small range, so only the near 0 Fresnel values survive as a gradient. Everything else gets clamped, and then the edges basically go away, but it leaves us with a really interesting soft center. So if I made this really, really tiny, such as 0.01, you can see that I can make the edges go completely away. So 0.03 gives us this very cool effect with just a haze of the sphere, which I think looks quite nice. Now, what I'd like to do is to combine this with this Voronoi texture. So I'm going to take the same thing over here, and we're going to make a slight change. Now, I'm going to make this into 0.02, and we are going to multiply these together, right? So if I multiply these together like so, and fed that into the opacity, what you'll see is that we get a really strong Voronoi pattern. And I want it to be very light and sort of not super noticeable. So before we do anything, I'm going to multiply it by 10% again, just to make it really weak, and then pass that through. So now you can see it's barely visible. You can almost not see it. Then what we can do is take this effect here, and we can add it to this Fresnel plus smooth step at the bottom. So if I do this and I show you what it looks like, we start to get this really interesting effect where the Voronoi is really doing some work, and you can kind of see it around the edges. And as I say to all my students, especially in the shader module, when we're playing around with these things, it's really useful to kind of tweak all the numbers and understand, like, tweak it in layers, understand what you're doing in layers first and foremost, and then you can start to see a little bit more results. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to make the sphere a little bit stronger down here. So I actually multiplied this by something like 2. And then what that will do is give me more of the edge and sort of grow this pattern in the middle. So you can see here, I can make the sphere bigger or smaller, which might be something that you want to do. So you can see we can get really close to the edge. So you can make it really weak, and so we can modulate it as much as we want. So this is the default, this is a little bit bigger. It really depends on what you like to do. And obviously you can tweak either the smooth step or you can tweak the multiply. So you could, for example, make a really, really tiny smooth step, so 0.005 or something like that. And then you can multiply it by 5, and then you'll get this like sort of like really weak result if that's what you're looking for. So in my particular instance, in my particular case, what I would like to do is just mess around with the 0.03, which I think looks pretty good. And then I'll kind of make it just a little bit stronger, by like maybe 1.2 or something like that. And I think that that looks pretty interesting and pretty cool. Now, another thing that we could do here is we could decide if the Fresnel is a bit, if the sort of Voronoi is a little bit too strong or a little bit too weak. And we could further add a multiply here to actually modulate this effect. So if I did something like half the strength of the effect, you can see that now, or if I did even 10% of the effect, you can see that as I increase this effect strength, you can see more of the Voronoi, right? So I want it to be really, really, really minor when we see the Voronoi. So this is what I was doing. You could obviously leave it as it is, and you'll notice the pattern a tiny bit more. So it's completely up to you with what you would like to do in your effect. But that effectively is the sphere. And so when we add these two together, we get this really interesting result, which, if I do say so myself, I think works pretty well. Now, for full disclosure, like the way that I did this in the original is that I tweaked these values a tiny bit more. So I actually messed around, used the multiply, and got myself into a very sort of smooth sphere. And the way that I did that is by setting this to 0.005 and multiplying this by 5, so it gets a little bit stronger. And then I also multiplied this by 0.1, like so. Okay, so that's what I did for my effect in the project. I made it really quite weak, as it were. So just something to consider. Make sure that it's something that you are doing. And then what I wanted to do is to bring it up a bit more. Well, I'm messing with that in the color. So then I multiply this again by, an emissive boost. So something like 5. This is pretty much what I've done. So you have a lot of levers to pull here and areas to tweak. So it's completely up to you what you would like to do for your effect. But that's what I did. So if you wanted to keep it at 0.03 and, do something like 1.2, you'll start to get this kind of an effect. So I wanted like a really, really smooth sphere, and that's how I achieved it. So we'll move on now, as I'll just revert all my values here, and we'll be good to go. So that's what I did for the blink sphere. Okay, so let's move swiftly to the blink swirl. And the blink swirl is going to be these little cylinder pieces on the top and the bottom. So I've added those now, and I've renamed them accordingly because we will have a black band and a blue band. And the black band is on the outside and the blue band is on the inside. So I've just duplicated this one and then scaled it in. I'm just trying to save us time here because this is really basic and not super important. What is important though is that this is a custom mesh that I created, and this custom mesh is very simple. It's just a strip of a cylinder. So if I remove the shader here, you can just see it's just a little strip. And at the moment it's not double-sided, which is why you can see through it. And that's basically it. And what I did is an experiment in mapping this from 0 to 1, which in my opinion isn't really recommended. I don't think it worked like perfectly, so I would do this differently if I were to do it again. But for our purposes, it does work, and we're just going to continue on. So I've built a new material here, and what we're going to do is just have a texture sample, which we already have, with the custom textures that I've built. Super basic texture, 512 by 512, just a little bit of a cutout. That's it. There is nothing to this, but as you can see, it is a white texture. So that means it has no color, and that is why I would like to multiply it by a color. Now, in the project files, the way that I've done this is very customizable using custom primitive data. I'm not doing that here for speed and ease, just so that we can see and iterate on our effects really quickly. So this is just something to consider. Now, if you want to, um, the way that I would suggest doing this at least is to have custom primitive data in this color node here, because if you do, then we can use the same material to change both the black band and the blue band, and we don't have to do anything. So that's the only thing that I'm actually going to do here because I think it's useful. So I'm going to chuck this into the emissive color and make it unlit. And again, because there's going to have to be some translucency here, I'm going to use the gray transmittance, right? And what we can do is we can pass the alpha into the opacity override. But before I do that, I'm going to multiply it because I want it to be less strong. I want to kind of see through the effect a little bit. So this is what I want, and it's hard to see what's going on. And that's because I would need to sort of find the mesh here, which I have, and I want to look at it in the preview. So as you can see, this works. This is mapping out pretty nicely for me, and I can see through it because you can see the trees, and that's why the 50% opacity to me matters. Okay. We're going to make this double-sided because I want to see the other side of the swirl. That is important to me. This makes sense, though, that it is open in the back because the texture is open in the sides, right? You wouldn't connect these two together. So this is fine. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to use custom primitive data here just because I don't want to have to make a material instance just to change one color. That's a really wasteful thing to do, and we shouldn't be doing that. So I'm going to convert this to a parameter. I'm going to call it color, and this is going to use custom primitive data. We're going to apply and save, and by default, when you use custom primitive data, the issue is that it will default to black, which for us is fine because we do need a black one anyway. And so we're going to be able to tweak this on the blueprint itself. Now, here is where things get a little bit trickier. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a time node, and we need to talk about how this thing is going to move because it actually rotates. And I could just pan this texture here and then it would rotate the texture and that works fine. But actually, I'd like to properly rotate this and have full control of how this works. So for that to be the case, we need to multiply time by a certain speed because I want it to be not super fast. So we're going to multiply this, and I'm probably going to half the speed of time. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to see this bobbing up and down a little bit. So if you know anything about shaders, you know that we need a sine wave for that. Now, what you can do with the sine wave is decide the period, so the length of time that it takes for it to reset. So I'm going to set that to 2. And what we do normally with sine waves, because I'll grab my pen really quickly here and sort of demonstrate. It's a very common thing for when using a sine wave. For a sine wave will go up into 1 and then dip down to -1, and that's not necessarily what we want to do. In this case, if you imagine our swirling thing that's going to bob up and down, it would go below the floor, which we don't want it to do. We'd like to stay where it is and just kind of go up and kind of come back to exactly this point and never go beyond it. So for that to be an easy thing for us to achieve, what we use is a constant bias scale. And this constant bias scale node by default will add it will add 1 and then multiply it by half. So this is the addition, this is the multiplication. So if you can imagine that if we go to -1, well, we've added 1. So now we no longer do that. So we go to 0, but because we've added 1, we go to 2 and then come back to 0. But if we then multiply it by 0.5, we now have from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. And that is what the constant bias scale is doing. So if no one's ever explained that to you before, there you go. This is how it works. So now if we multiply this by, say, the direction that we'd like to move this in, we can see some interesting effects. So we're going to take this, and push it into the wall position offset. And what will happen is that we should start to see this object begin to move as soon as we add the position to it. So I will stop previewing this node so that we can see what is going to happen. And as you can see here, we already have it bobbing up and down, which is exactly what we want for this effect. Cool. Now, what I also want is for this object to rotate. So for that to be the case, again, I'm going to grab some time and we're going to do something here. We need to rotate this thing in an interesting way. So we're going to add the rotation on top of this. So the rotation is going to plug into the B. And the way this works is you can use the rotate about axis. Now, the rotate about axis will take a rotation angle. So I will multiply time by a speed. In this case, I will just do the rotation speed as something like 2. And then you can kind of see what's going to happen. We also need sort of like a normalized angle of rotation. So in this case, I'll just plug this in so you can see how it works. As far as a pivot point, we don't really have a pivot point. So we will, if you wanted to rotate it from a specific part of the mesh, we would mess with it. And then the position here, this is where we're going to do some interesting stuff. I have a video on this on the channel about what we're about to do, but we need to get the object's actual world position. We need to transform this position into local space, just in case we do want to manually rotate this preview actor or this object. We want it to actually respect its rotation. So I'm going to transform this position from absolute world space to local space. And this is just something that I do with most of the rotations that I do. And then we can take this vector here, because it'll output a vector for us. We can transform it. Transform vector, and we will take local space right back to world space, and that should be us. And what that'll do is, at the moment, absolutely nothing, because it's just going to go a little bit crazy. As you can see, it doesn't really know what it is that we're trying to do. So if I added a little bit of rotation here, you can see it goes a bit crazy. And so what we want to do is define what is the axis that this should be rotating on, like fully. And in this case, it's the Z axis that we want it to rotate on. And then what we can do is we can decide, hey, I don't want any Y. And this will mean that it will spin as we expect. But what I would like is a very tiny bit of a wobble in the Y. So I want to do 0.1. 0.01, 0.02, something like that, so that we get a little bit of a change on what's going on. Now, this also is something that we should make as custom primitive data, because we want the effect to look really interesting. And so for now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to leave these two alone so that we can just move forward. And what I'll do is I'll just change the color. And again, in the final project, if you want, you can just convert these two to custom primitive data. You can convert the speed as well to custom primitive data. That is what I've done so that I have full control over all of the rotation axes, the rotation speed, and etc. And you can just go from there. But I don't want to like get too bogged down because it makes iteration really slow. Um, so I don't want to do that for this video, and I hope you understand because setting custom primitive data in blueprints is very manual, and then you can't visualize it until you've put it into the world. So there's a few things there, unless you're doing things in the construction script, which I don't want to be doing. So, hopefully this makes sense. I'll show you how it works with the color, and then you can very easily apply that to these as a little challenge for yourself. Okay, so that is the swirl now complete. And with this stuff, you can honestly do some really, really interesting things because um, if you imagine um, that we could move this object left and right, we can do very interesting things. And some of the interesting things that you can do is these sort of swirling patterns. And this is that same shader, but there's a slight little tweak. And because we're mapped to 0 to 1, here's what I've done. This is why it's really important that we do these space transformations here. Because as we move this object around, if we don't do this, it will start to incrementally take the world position and get like bigger, or the effect will just start getting completely out of hand instead of being a consistent thing that we could scale and rotate and actually have it work nicely in real time. Now, what I've done here is really, really simple. I apologize for the mess of nodes, but I will walk you through it now. Obviously, this isn't what the shader we're trying to build, but I want to show you the potential, right? If we just take a texture coordinate node and mask the green, the X channel, so the red channel, we will then, because our texture is mapped to an object that is 0 to 1, we're effectively masking half of the object. Or if you use a smooth step, we have a very smooth mask, which is giving us this of an effect. So when we combine this with our world position offset, we will get some really interesting results. So we add the rotations together with the world position offset, but then we multiply them by the smooth step as sort of our mask. So now what you can do is you can increase the size of this. You could be pretty significant about it. And then you've got some interesting sort of cloth swirls and all this sort of interesting stuff here that otherwise you wouldn't have. And it's just a really interesting thing for you to build. Now, again, it's just something that you can consider. You don't have to, um, you know, think about it too much. It's not that expensive on the pixel shader or the vertex shader, so it is pretty okay as an effect to use. So I just wanted to show you that as a bit of an example, and you can do all kinds of stuff like this really cheaply. So, and on top of that, messing with the rotation, this is where things can be a little bit finicky, but you can make it so that it does really cool effects, right? And you can also add rotation to the other side of things. So you can see here that we can start spinning this thing in really interesting ways. You can even rotate it the other way, as you can see. So I'll leave that with you to play around and mess around so you can understand how this is going to work. But just be careful with the numbers so you don't overcrank them. You can also mess with the sine wave, make the period bigger so that it will like work at a longer period of time. And then you can also modify the constant bias scale so that as you do this, you're effectively multiplying the size of this, and the influence will start to shift towards the tip, as you can see here. So it might be something that is very useful to you in the future. These shader fundamentals are really foundational, and that's why we spend so much time on them at Hard Edge. Play around, get familiar. So obviously this is not what we want to do. So I'm going to go back and plug everything back in to where it should be. And I will definitely fix my rotations because we don't need that, do we? Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm now going to walk you through the little vortex cone that we have that will allow, when the spheres split, for them to look like they join together. So we'll have two of these meshes, and if I show you here on the Blink preview that is actually finished, I will come in here and show you that. It'll be in here. What we have is this interesting sort of vortex swirl static mesh here. And what happens is as I move one mesh away from the other, you can see they start kind of connecting. And it's a really cool effect now. They have a very cool sort of shader, like panner texture that they're using. I just have some basic engine stuff that I'm using to show you. You could definitely make this look a lot better with the right textures, but it goes a little bit beyond the scope of the tutorial. So this is the effect that we're trying to do. So the sphere will split. It looks really nice and sort of fluid, and then it kind of connects. Now, this is two things. The first thing is that we need to have a custom mesh, and in my case you can see here it's just a little cylinder object here that we have. So I'll go and open that up just to show you. It's very simple. I just took the blink sphere and I just kind of extruded it down and just scaled it up and down. That's basically it. It's really not that fancy. And if you were to look at the UVs of this, again, it's the same as before, 0 to 1, just so that we could do some interesting things to it in the future. That's basically it. Nothing much else to kind of report here. And I don't want to be messing around with this object here because I haven't changed it. So I'm going to reload this asset so it goes back to default so we can have it how it is. So let me walk you through that shader so it makes a little bit of sense. It is basically doing the same things that we are already doing. So this stuff here is exactly the same as the sphere. Really zero change, actually. We could make it slightly different if we wanted to, but again, um, it's just something that I thought looked fine the way I did it. Um, and so that's how I left it. So the Fresnel here is exactly the same setup as before, so we're not going to dwell too much on that. Now, on the sort of color and opacity side of things, it gets a little bit different. So we're panning kind of two textures along here, but we're still using the same noise node, and we have a little bit of sort of different tiling. So you can see here, what I'm doing is I have some irregular tiling so that it looks a little bit more stretched and it feels like a flow. So for me, 3 looked pretty good. And then obviously you could tweak things like this so that it looks a little bit more interesting and more swirly, vortexy. And what I'm doing is, again, multiplying time by half the speed. So time is half the speed of it should be. So it's the nice speed. I think it looks pretty good. And we're moving it down in the X and sort of diagonally in the Y as well. So again, same kind of effect of the sphere, but it's flipped so that it looks interesting and different. Um, then we need to talk about this section here, which is the sort of the new part. Now, this you've already seen, right? Time with a sine and a constant bias scale. Same thing here. The period here is of 3. I'll show you what it looks like with a period of 1. So it's a little bit too fast. So if I do a period of 3 or even 5, I can really slow this down and make it so it doesn't look as jarring. So a period of 3 worked for me with this sine wave. So we take this constant bias scale, and this is sort of one of our final little masks that we do. We also take what I've demoed just now, which is a texture coordinate node, and we mask the up and down. So what we do here is very simple. We build a gradient for the top of the mesh, right? So that's from the bottom to the top. We then invert this gradient. So if we preview this node with a 1 minus, we're flipping the gradient, and then we're multiplying them together. This is a really cool and very common trick to do so that we can mask out both the top and the bottom of the mesh. I then take this and multiply it by 2 so that we get a little bit more contrast on everything. So, everything that's dark will stay dark, but if I did something like, 5, you'll really see the middle get really bright. So it's just one of those things that we can do to modulate the contrast here. Now, All of this then gets masked by our Fresnel, which I think works pretty well. So you can see now that the swirling effect would only happen in the middle of the object, and that then gets piped in to the constant bias scale through the sine wave. So this is effectively what we're doing. We're sort of pulsing the strength of this, and I think it looks pretty cool. That then gets used as a mask for yet another panner that is then going in the opposite direction. So you see it's moving positive in the X, so towards the right, and then it's going again downwards in the Y at a different speed though. So then we overlay these effects and we do a little bit of tweaking. The same thing I did before in the other texture where I just want to brighten it up a bit, get it mostly white so that it works well. So if we start previewing this node, you can see, you can't really see much of what it's doing here, but it works really well when you start multiplying it by the color. So you can see here, there's this very fast sort of stream, which I then multiply again and put into the emissive color. So that's our main color, which then lets the Fresnel do its job. So if I stop previewing this now, that is the effect that we get. So if you did something like 10, you'll start to really push the colors, and then you can see that that's where this sort of stream texture comes in. You could change this, you could change the parameters, you could change the texture coordinates so that we're less stretchy, for example, and then you'll start to see more of this pattern of this texture. But again, it's really up to you of how you'd want this to be. You can tweak it to your heart's desire. So by default, this is what the texture looks like. It's not, it's a little bit too noisy for me. So the texture itself is a T noise 01. So I just wanted it to be a little bit different. So I think I did 4 and 0.5, and then it was kind of interesting. So that's basically it for this sort of vortex swirl shader. I'm just going through this one quickly because it's the same technique I've just shown you applied to a different context, right? So hopefully this all makes sense and you can, look at the nodes and start coming to your own conclusions of how you would want to build something like this. I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm just trying to make it interesting, and close enough is what I would say. Okay, so that's it for this shader. We don't need to worry too much more about that. Now we need to move on to a couple of extra bits. Okay, so the last material that we need to talk about, really, I'll show you the other ones really quickly, but the last ones to talk about is just the effect when we teleport and we have the sort of flames next to our camera. And that is just a very simple flip book that I built with Embergen. And I'll just kind of show you here what the texture looks like. And that's it. It's just like an explosion flip book that's 8 by 8, and I've made a 2K texture out of it. That's it. So we'll talk about this more now when we talk about the actual particle systems, which I will run through fairly quickly as well because they're not that complicated, and I just wanted to show you how they work. The other materials are very simple. The blink lines are just a texture sample multiplied by particle color. So these are the sort of vertical lines that you see when we are they're basically overlaid on the front of the effect. I just used the same texture for the swirl, and they worked quite well because I stretched the particle system. So effectively what we do is we have the particle, we stretch it to be really tall, but then it's mapped to this, so then it becomes all jaggedy and interesting, and that's what I did. So nothing very fancy there at all. And then finally we have this mantle arrow that I created, and again, very, very simple. It's just an arrow texture that I built in Photoshop. There's nothing to it. This is it. It was just a triangle that I drew with a black triangle and a layer underneath. I merged it together. There's nothing really to it. So there's nothing to explain. These are all the shaders to build the effect. And now we need to move on to particle systems. And this is the really fun part. So again, I think if I was to create this step by step, one by one, the tutorial will be like super long. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through the modules and the things I've changed, how I started them, and then you'll be able to recreate them quite quickly. Let's continue. I think by far the most interesting one is the mantle indicator. So let's walk through this so that it makes a little bit of sense. I've left the name here so that you can see where it started from. It is a fountain, and it makes sense, right? A fountain just sprays the same particle up, and I thought that this was the best way to start this effect. There isn't much to see here or much to say, so what I've done is I've just reduced the spawn rate right down. Now, if you can see, if I did a bigger spawn rate, it's just a question of tweaking what's going on. So this is a really interesting effect. So as you look at this module here, you can see how potentially interesting things are. So I left it at, in this particular instance, 6 because it gave me the exact look that I was looking for. But this is really interesting. You could have this as a different sort of effect for something else in your game, and it would work quite well. So I think actually this is a really cool little system. So the main trick here is that these particles are set to a non-uniform size. This is important. So you can see here, the blink effect, the arrow kind of splays out at the bottom and then shrinks itself as it goes in. So it kind of needs to go from a really stretched size to a really small size. So these are the settings that I've used. And, we don't really need to worry about mass or anything like that. And importantly, the lifetime is really quite short. So that's so that they can actually give me enough of a time. So I wanted to see 3 of them before they disappear. And to me, 0.7 worked quite well. The shape location is just a box, and what I've done is I've just made the box really, really small. So if I did the box a little bit bigger like this, what you'll see is that it won't change much of the effect, but if you did the box really big, you start to get this weird situation. So by limiting the size of the box here to something really quite small, we ensure that they work in this really tight plane, this little tight line, which is what we want to see. Okay. And then the midpoint we just left where it was, so that is fine with me. I didn't need to change it. And then obviously this makes sense. We have velocity going up in the Z. That's all. There is nothing else to say. And obviously you can see everything else I've set in the initialized particle here. So, I've not done anything on the rotation. So I've reset all of that to be default. You can just copy my attributes if you like. It's really quite simple. Again, the project is available for those who are interested in saving time. Now, the main difference here is that I have a custom curve on scale sprite size. And as you can see, what's going on here is that the x-axis will start at 1 and then start to decrease its size. And that's how we start to get this sort of splaying effect. As you can see here, if I shift it downwards, you can see they stay bigger for longer. So this is the sort of sweet spot that I found. And then on the y-axis, I'll probably smooth this curve out just to show you. What we're doing here is we're making them longer. Like they're quite long at the start, and then they get sort of cramped over time. It's annoying when the preview doesn't work, but hopefully it was working so nicely then. But I think you get the idea. We're basically compressing them, as you can see there. So if I took this to a pretty silly number such as 5, you'll see what we're doing here, right? So that's obviously I'm shrinking them by half the size over time. So then they'll sort of get really compressed on the y-axis as they live. That's basically all I'm doing so that it shrinks them up. Nothing else really to show here. Scaling the color is very simple. We start at 0, so it fades. It stays constant here at the 1 mark and then fades out. Very simple, right? Fades in, stays constant, fades out. You can see that working fine. Solve forces and velocity is required, and in the sprite renderer, I've only changed the material to be the blink mantle. That is the lines. And I hope you can see that this is a really interesting effect that you could use in a variety of ways. You could add rotations to this. It is really quite cool. So if you did like a random rotation, you can start to have some really interesting triangles. If you played Pokopia, this is how they would have done like their little triangles that you can see on really special items and things like that. So anyway, this is the blink a mantle indicator. Let's move swiftly along to the other particle systems. The first one we're going to talk about is the lines, or the second one, really. And as you can see here, this is what the system is doing. It is another fountain, and we've got a spawn rate of 10. As you can see here, we're in unlit mode, and I think we're still using the wireframe thing from the shader, so it's hard to see what's going on, but hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. Um, so what we're doing is we're effectively just dropping them in different locations randomly and giving them a super short lifetime, and we stretch them as far as size goes. So now it's important here to look at the color, because in the game you have black lines and blue lines. So what I've done is I've made a color array and used the first index as black and the second index as blue. The reason for this is because if you flip these, the black never shows up. It just doesn't, for some reason, it doesn't like that order of operations. I'm not really sure why. Has a super short lifetime. That's very important. And as you can see, the sprite size here is just kind of exaggerated to be very long. So if you wanted it to be longer or bigger, you could do 60. Looked pretty good to me, but I can leave it at 75 for us to demo later so you can see them clearer. As with the other particle system, we have a very simple box size, just a meter box, meter by meter box, and we just add a very basic amount of velocity to the meshes, but they live for such a small amount of time when you look at the initialization of the particle that they just effectively drop a tiny bit, and that's all really that they do. There's nothing fancy about this effect. It's really quick and easy. Hopefully that makes sense to you, and you can see that there is no secret on how this works. We add a bit of velocity, we have a specific size and spawn location shape, and that is it. The most special thing about this is just the color data being an array, which again is very simple. You just need to select that as an option here. You just type in array and you'll be able to do that. So, okay, let's move on now to the attraction swirl, which has a little bit more to it because it actually has the blink lines inside it. So the attraction swirl is very simple. Yet again, it's another fountain. And the main thing here is that we have this sort of flight orientation with a bit of drag and curl noise force. But let's walk through the particle system step by step so you can see. Have a much bigger spawn rate. That's important. We've got around 45. We initialize the particle with these settings here. Again, we're sort of in a non-uniform way, making the sprites a random size. That's important because I didn't want them to just be little spheres. I want them to be a little bit stretched here and there. The location is a sphere. These are the settings that I used. Nothing fancy. And as you can see, I've added a bit more surface distribution so that they kind of spawn on the outside of this, invisible sphere. The velocity is quite random, minus 200 in to 200 in all axes, so that it goes up, down, sideways, back, forth, everything. Effectively go everywhere. That's what I wanted it to do. And then what we have is this flight orientation, which as you can see, I haven't really changed anything. I just put this update mesh orientation, changed it to flight, and that was it. We have a tiny little bit of drag, not too much drag, just a little bit. And then I have a very simple fade on the color so that we go from 0 to 1. So they fade in, and there you go. That's all that happens to them. So they start at 1 and then they fade back at 0. So realistically, you can see they pop into view, but I think it looks fine. We could obviously make it so that they do something like this, so they'll fade in and then fade out, but personally, I thought that it looked fine when they pop into view, such as they have been at the moment. Cool. So that's the scale color. I use a little bit of curl noise so that we get this really nice randomness to this. So it looks like embers almost or flies. That works really well. The soul force and velocity is just necessary. And then what we do is we mess around with the color. I guess I have 2 scale colors and I shouldn't have that. So there you go. That's my actual scale color that I did, I guess. So I did actually fade it in and out. There you go. Nothing else to say here. There's nothing else to show. This is how simple the effect can be made. And I just brought in the blink lines emitter so that I could have them both in one place. Okay. Now, the last but not least is the blink flame. Now, this one here is interesting because what I've done is I've spawned them in sort of like a ring, and I've made it so that it's a flip book so that it looks a little bit like this. So if we're simulating the camera, this is what it looks like. So we have a small burst of particles and then the flame flip book playing. Very simple here that we have sub UV blending with the sub image size, and we've picked our flipbook material. You can either do the flipbook in the shader or you can do the flipbook in the particle system. I've decided to do it in the particle system, okay? For that to work, you will need a sub UV animation so that it will work fine. And as you can see, that is all I've done. Nothing fancy there. And everything else is pretty simple. I have a very small lifetime for this flipbook to operate because I want it to be really quite quick. And I've made it so that the sprite size is, again, non-uniform. So we stretch the quads. I wanted it to be seen through, and I basically place it right in front of the camera. The biggest thing here is the shape location because it is in a ring or a disc. So you have to imagine that we're spawning them in a ring like this. And then if you looked at it from the side, what we're saying is that, I'll try and draw this in some perspective, you know, they're sort of spawning that way around a ring. Okay. These are the settings for the ring. It's only got a couple of changes, and specifically the axis angle is what allows us to have the rotation work correctly here, because trying to rotate a flip book doesn't work very well. So you have to actually modify things in this way here, which to me seemed to work okay, because otherwise the flip book is pointing up. So, you know, when you try and recreate this, if you don't match these settings here, it won't work. So all of this should be fairly basic and straightforward. You can see how we've set things up on the spiral amount. So you can see here, this is what it's doing. So I'm just kind of demoing so you can see. But I'm going to leave it how it was because I've kind of got a really good sweet spot here. As far as velocity goes, because it's facing the X, I want them to move forward a tiny bit. So if I did something like 100, you'll see that they move forward like this, and that will drastically change the effect, which I don't want it to do. I just want like a little bit of speed, like not much. So it might not be doing very much at all actually, but I do think it is helping a little bit. We have a bit of drag because, well, I'd say more drag because I don't want it to kind of move too much. Same thing, we will fade these particles out. It doesn't really matter because it's a flip book, so potentially you don't really, you know, need these. So we could probably remove this one. And very simple, we just scale the sprite size by the velocity. So that's why potentially this is something that you'd want to do. But I believe that both of these here like aren't necessarily required aside from the scale by speed. So you can see here we start at 0 and then we allow it to get a little bit bigger because I don't want them to be super duper stretched. That's basically it. So if we turn this one off, you can see that that's the effect that we would get. So if we were sort of right in there, this is what you would see, which might be exactly what you want. The small burst is very simple. We're just adding velocity in a cone. Again, we're spawning a set number of particles here. So in this particular instance, we spawn 50. In this one, we spawn 10 of them. So spawn 50 particles, initialize them with these settings. Again, non-uniform sizes. And what I'm trying to do is just push the particles forward, right? So after setting their lifetime, which is about 3 seconds, because I want to see them after they've lived for a little bit, because there is this after effect of the blink that we need to do. We then add this velocity in a cone. I'm just making sure that they really shoot forward. Very, very simple stuff, minimum, max. And the sort of axis for the cone, put them inside of a box, so they will just spawn in a, again, elongated box. Nothing, it's actually a meter box, not even elongated, so I misspeak there. And that's basically it. So they rotate, they have a bit of drag, they have a bit of curl noise, and again, they will just start, because we don't see them when they spawn, they start fully opaque and then fade out because they're behind us when they spawn, so we don't care about them actually fading in. So that's why we do that. That's basically it. And I do scale these sprites by the speed once again because I like just that little bit of movement, stretching the particles a tiny bit. That is all of the particle systems. I'm sorry that I'm kind of going through them a bit quickly. It's fairly self-explanatory when you look at these and play around. Make your effect different if you like, but it's kind of hard to just, if I was to build the particle systems all by hand, one by one, this would be like another hour tutorial, and I feel like that's a bit too much for what is in effect some really simple particle systems. Okay, so hopefully this is all good and clear for you, and what I'd like to do now is focus the last bits of the tutorial on how I turn these off and trigger them on and etc. So let's wrap things up. Okay, so we're in the home stretch now. I'm going to close all of these windows off because they're just going to get in our way. And what we will do is we will implement all of these effects onto the blueprint for the blink. And after we've done that, we will be done and you will have a fully functioning blink system. Okay, so let's take both of these bands, or all four of these bands, and let's add the swirl material. So we'll do the blink swirl YouTube here. And as you can see, the bottom ones are blue and the top ones are black. So we need to change that. And as I said to you before, this here is all based off of custom primitive data. As you can see, I already have some custom primitive data here. Unfortunately, if I delete these now, I believe the engine will crash, which is unfortunate. So I don't want that to be the case. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure it'll crash. This is a 5.7 bug that I've seen. So if you've added custom primitive data and then you delete it, it'll crash the engine, which isn't really great. So I'm not going to delete them now. If you don't know how to add custom primitive data, just open up this custom primitive data area here in the details panel, do the plus, and then you can set your colors accordingly. So in this particular instance, this one here should be black. And unfortunately, you won't be able to see the preview depending on the circumstances, especially if you are like, at least in my previous example, I couldn't see this update live, unfortunately. I'd have to place it into the world to see it. So maybe again, it was a bug or something else was happening. It doesn't really matter. So what I'm going to do here is grab the blue band at the bottom, and I'm going to try and just copy these values, right? So here's what I'll do. I'll just say, I'm going to make these consistent to 0.1, 0.28, 0.63. And then I'm just going to copy these values up and down. So 63, 28, and 01. So 63, 0.28, and 0.1. And now we've matched them pretty nicely. So that's pretty good. We've got the bottom sphere and top sphere. The things that we're missing here is our swirl cones. So we need to add those now. Again, if you add a static mesh, remember that it is going to come in with collisions. So no collisions, and then we can do, I believe I called it the vortex. There we go. And as you can see, I made them a ridiculous size, which is unfortunate. So I'm just going to scale them down. And as far as materials go, we want to just add our vertex swirl material. Okay, like so, as you can see here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this all the way down so that it kind of matches what we need, like so. And that should be okay. And we can tweak this later. It should be all right like that. And this vertex swirl that we're doing, so if we do vortex swirl top, we can connect that to the top sphere as well. And then now if I move the top sphere, I should be able to see the swirl right below it, which works how I expect. The other thing that I'm expecting though is to see like the top of the lines there. We might want to move them a little bit lower. So probably something like this is going to work a little bit better for us. And now we'll do the same thing for the bottom for the vortex swirl. So we're going to apply that to there, and this is going to be the vortex swirl and bottom. Now, obviously this needs to be flipped 180, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to reset this here, do 180 in the Y actually, so 180 like so. And then what I want to do is move this down so that it matches with the bottom sphere. So something like that should work. So now if I move the top sphere, it will join up with the bottom sphere, which is exactly what we want. Now, the other thing now that we need to consider is that this mantle sphere here is fine. We probably just need to move it down to sort of where the cone is. So probably around there, that will work fine for us. But we need this to be our particle system. So this is where things are going to get a little bit tricky. The first thing that we want to do now is add a Niagara particle system. Now, normally, I wouldn't advocate for doing this. I'm just going to attach it to the default scene root. And I'll explain this in the next video when it comes to talking about performance, and we can compare it. When we do this, we have no options for pooling the particles that it spawns, and that is an important thing. So I'll just briefly touch upon that. So if we do spawn system at location, we have these options for pooling, which is really important because we want to reuse the particles as they get spawned. And if you just use a component, as far as I understand, this isn't set or settable by default. So this is something that ideally we would spawn on begin play, attach to this actor, and make sure that the pooling is on auto release. But we're going to work on that in the future. So I'm going to call this the NS swirl attraction, and we are going to use that. So swirl attraction, there we are. And what you'll see is that it's already working quite nicely there for us, which is exactly what we want. So pretty cool. This one is always active for the most part, so we don't actually have to touch it, though we will need to turn it off, I think, for the mantling. So we need to keep an eye on that, okay? The other thing that we need to do is add the mantle lines. So instead of a cone, we have to have the mantle lines. So what I'm going to do is we're going to add another particle system. This one here is going to be parented underneath the mantle position. This is going to be NS mantle arrows, I guess is what I'm going to call it. And the mantle position itself, well, it shouldn't be visible anymore, right? That's the main thing. I just want it to be a reference point. So we're going to do a hidden in game. Now, what we'd like to do with the mantle arrows here is if we do mantle, you'll see that it's immediately visible. We don't want that, so we need to only activate this when it needs to be activated. And then, yeah, in this particular instance, the mantle sphere should not be hidden, right? So that's all good, but the mantle position should be hidden in game. So we'll compile that and save it, and it should work okay. And we can also make it so that visibility-wise, it is not visible so that we are not seeing it anymore. And that is pretty much all we need to see. You can obviously leave it as auto activate, but then we need to deactivate it on begin play. So it is up to you what you would like to do here. So I think what I did actually is I did auto activate it so that it would stay warm. Yes, this is what I did. So we're leaving this active, but we're making it not visible. The reason for that is because if we deactivate it, when we reactivate it, it will take time for the particles to spawn again. So we just leave them kind of in the background. Again, we'll talk about all of this stuff when it comes to performance very, very soon. However, here's what we can do. We can now delete these preview ones that we have. And we have our effect. And it's looks weird, but it's there because we haven't really hidden anything, but it's there and it works pretty cool. So, and also we have the debug lines to kind of show. So let's now hide things properly in this blueprint. First thing to do is to remember that when we hide the mantle position, it needs to propagate the children, but it doesn't actually work, unfortunately. So we want to make sure that we're staying on top of this more than anything else in this effect. The first thing I'm going to do is on begin play, I'm going to hide the mantle lines or the mantle arrows. So I'm going to set the visibility to be hidden. So set hidden in game, we're going to have them be hidden now. I also want to make sure that the actual mantle sphere, like that shouldn't be visible either. So I want to make sure that that is the case as well. So now when we hit play, we shouldn't really see that anymore if I don't minimize the whole game. So here we go, and this is looking more like what we expect, which is really cool. So that's working nicely. And now the snapping we'll address probably in the last video. So now you can see here that we have a bit of a problem when we do hit like a mantle location, and you can see the swirls. They continue after we've teleported. We have just a lot of things to fix. So this is what we're going to have to do, right? So you can see here, it mostly works and the positioning isn't great. So we're going to want to move that down and do a few tweaks and things like that. So let's go ahead and get all of that done now. So we're going to add the swirl attraction to the deactivation, which will then take care of the lines plus the swirl, which we're staying in there. So that's just verified that that is working. So we'll blink and the particles disappear, which is exactly what we want. But then they don't reappear, which is not what we want. So let's go ahead and fix that right now. So again, let's open this up. We'll come into here. And now when we activate the preview, we need to make sure that the swirl attraction is visible, which is important, right? Cool. Now, when we mantle, we have to do a few things. First of all, as you can see, the mantle arrows are a bit too high comparative to the sphere. So I'm going to move them down like so, which is important. And then when we look into the event graph here, we need to ensure that we're doing everything we can to have things be consistent, I guess is the best way to say it. So when we set this new hidden to propagate to children, this will work quite well, but I would also like for the swirl attraction to stay while we're doing things as well. So if it is getting hidden, which it probably is when we deactivate the preview, I want to make sure that that comes back. So now we should have the mantle show up ideally there. So that's working quite well for us right there. Now, when we are not mantling, though, we need to deactivate. And also, we should probably, inside of our component, which should be here, I want to take those debug lines out so that they stop distracting us. No. There we go. So that'll be helpful for us. And what we can do is inside the Blink preview now, when we aren't mantling, well, we need to make sure that we are deactivating that preview. We're probably going to want to do that with a separate custom event. So we'll go custom event. We'll go disable mantle lines, which is here. And what we can do is just set the mantle lines to be hidden in game, really. So we'll go over here. Where's the mantle arrows? I keep saying mantle lines because that's what I called it in the other blueprint. Sorry, the mantle arrows. Hidden in game. We will hide this for sure. And that should work nicely for us. We could put the... I guess we could put that sphere underneath it as well and probably hide it. So I'll just put the mantle sphere on there as well. And I think that that will work fine. Now, where do we call this? Well, we need to call this from the component wherever we're not mantling. Because you see, we activate preview, but we want to make sure that we deactivate the mantle preview. What did we call it? We called it disable mantle lines. So we'll just call it deactivate mantle arrows so that it is correct. So we do that because we're not mantling like so. And any time that we are setting the mantling to be false, we need to make sure that we're doing exactly that. So we need to do these in all of these sort of sections because we are not mantling. And that should give us everything we need, I think, for this to work. So that is working fine for now. And then mantle lines are there. When we blink, that works. There we go. And so if we mantle and then it goes away and then that works fine, which is really good. Now, one thing to say is that I think by default, we've spaced out our top sphere too much and it shouldn't be this spaced out. So we should probably, when you look at the viewport, the reason it looks weird and things aren't lining up how we expect is because the top sphere, like we moved it up, which we shouldn't do. We should probably leave it, I guess, in the same height here as the other one, which I think is at 50. We should look at where it is. 44, fine. We'll just do 45. And we'll do the same thing for the top sphere. Like so. So that's why it was looking a bit awkward and weird. So now you can see they won't snap together like in an awkward way anymore. So that looks better and it feels like more like what we're looking for. So as soon as I go to that edge, that works really well. So now we fixed that. That's pretty good. And you can see they kind of connect to each other really nicely, which is cool. One of the things that we could do is we could make these look a tiny bit better. So we could just stretch it a tiny bit like this. And we could do the same thing for the top and just stretch it a tiny bit, move it down a tiny bit. And I think that that will look more interesting. Again, you could change the mesh and do anything you'd like, but I think this works pretty well. We should probably mask the bottom of that shader a bit more, but it's okay. It will be fine. But there we go. That's working really well. And there's very few little tweaks to do. So we're at the home stretch now. We've got to modify the post process and spawn the other particle system, and then we're done. So let's do that now. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is to spawn the particles at the head of our player, and we also need to modify the post-process volume when we let go of blink. So if you remember, when we let go, this is where the sort of field of view stuff is happening. And what we want to do is do a couple of things. So the first thing to do is we need to get a post-process volume. Now, this will change based off of your project, right? This is the part where I can't predict how it's going to work for you. And the main thing is that we need to apply a color change to the post-process volume that is currently active in the world. And you can either have a post-process volume attached to the character, or you'll have a post-process volume in a level. And so what's going to happen is, in this particular instance, you see I have a post-process volume in the level with an infinite extent. And so this is the my other project. This is the project files that are available for you if you want. And what you can see, I have more custom primitive data applied to this swirls at the bottom, and it's just a very few tweaks. Like it's nothing very different. Like it's basically the same thing, but with a couple of extra gubbins so that it looks a little bit smoother, a little bit more interesting. Um, but as you can see, it works exactly the same as the other one. So the thing is we need a post process volume. I can't control where that is in your project. And if you have multiple post process volumes in the game on your level or whatever it is that you're building, you need to think about your implementation. I can't tell you what to do there because I don't know your game, I don't know your project. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a post process in the world and we're going to find it and just make the functionality work. You need to tweak that to work for your project. It's just not possible for me to teach you how it would work universally. I can only give you the concepts, right? It really depends. So what we're going to do is on begin play for the component, or we could do with the player, it really depends. We will get all actors of class, and then we can do just a post-process volume like so. We can get the first result. Again, this is hard-coded. I will have a note on this in the project that is available so that, this should be changed. It's just something to keep in mind. We will promote this to a variable and say this is the post-process volume. And now we get to do things to it. The way you work with post-processing volumes is a bit weird. Uh, and there is no elegant way of setting settings in blueprints in a struct. It just looks a bit awful and there's not much you can do. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to get the Blink post-process, these post-process settings, right? These will be the default settings. So we'll get the settings and we'll promote this to a variable as well. So we'll come in here and we'll say that this is the original post-process settings, like so. Okay, so we'll set that as a variable for us to work with. And then what we need to do is we need to make a copy of this. And this is going to be our Blink PP settings, just to make it easier to type, but you should probably be consistent. So post process settings, like so. And so we're basically making a copy. We're just doing this. So we're taking the settings and we're making a copy. That's effectively what we're doing. Then what you can do is you can do set members in post-process settings. And it goes, oh, cool, this is this really interesting thing. What are we going to set? We're going to set the gain. And what I'd like to do is like the pins that I want to modify is just the color grading gain. So you can see we can do it to the shadows, to the midtones, all this stuff. I want the global one, okay? That means that I can now mess with these values. So I can just split this pin and I can change it. So the gain is going to be 1, 1.5, 3. So that means 0 in the red, a bit more green, a lot more blue, and then I'm going to actually brighten the image a lot by adding some alpha. That's basically it. And it'll look blue and interesting when we make it work. Now, the way we're going to trigger this is just by when we're running our tick and completing the sort of like when we let go of the button, we're just going to modify the post-process settings like very, very quickly. That's the idea, basically. It's just going to be instant. And then when we finish, we'll sort of flip backwards. We're not going to really fade. It's just going to happen. And then it's just going to be set back to what it was. It'll happen so quickly that it shouldn't be a problem is basically what I'm saying. So when we do Blink and we do all this stuff here, we get the post process and then we set the settings And the settings will be now the blink settings, so it'll immediately flash blue. And then what we do is we copy this, and we don't need that node anymore with the delay or whatever. That was just empty over there. When we deactivate the blink and we set the field of view to be 90, well, we're going to reset the post process to be the original. And I'll show you what that looks like now. So if we hit play and I do this, we need a post process, which we don't have. And then also we have a bunch of errors saying that we attempted to assign to none, and that's because we don't have a post process. So here's one of those things, right? Like this needs to be valid. And if it isn't valid, then, well, we don't do anything. But if it is valid, then we can do this and we won't have that error anymore. And obviously we need to check if it's valid down there, but look, we're trying to finish, so let's just finish and we can refine all of this when we talk about performance and issues and all kinds of other stuff, because we'll need to do this anyway in C++. So this should be fine. But if you don't have a post process, then that's bad. And so, you know, if you're doing any kind of change here, you would need to check if, again, the post process is valid and so on and so forth. So, you know, just for peace of mind, you can absolutely do that. And that's what I'll do. So actually, I'll do that here just to show you proper processes. It's going to get messy, and I apologize. So there we go. Very messy, and I do apologize, but there we go. Now we need a post-process volume. So we'll go post-process volume, and then I'll just type in extent because it is infinite extent unbound. And now we can save this level. The blueprint should find it, and there we go, as you can see. So that works pretty well, and that's working pretty good. Now we just need to trigger our particle system. So let's do that now. So this is the tricky part of this section here. The way to do this elegantly is, ideally, you're not using the mannequin. You have your own character. Your character has a bone, a camera, something that's different from this. So again, this is one of those things that it's a bit difficult for me to give you the perfect recipe that's going to work for you. So you have two options. The first option is put this particle system on the player when they trigger the blink, because we will have this in here. The player has this component, so it doesn't really know anything that's happening, which means ideally what you want is right at the start here, we want to spawn that particle system. So if we go spawn system attached, we can consider, you know, what we're doing here. So we should have the owner, which is the player. So what we can do is we can spawn this slightly afterwards. So we can move this over here. Probably there is fine. So something like this. The system we want to spawn is the, let's find it. It's the blink flame. So the blink flame is what we want to spawn. We want to attach it to a component. We can get the mesh from the character because that's just something you can do. This is the skeletal mesh. And we can attach it to the component at a specific point. Now, I believe if we opened up the first person character and we went into there, the skeleton itself in here for Manny, it has a bone for the head, which I believe is called just head, lowercase, I believe. We just close all these out and then we'll find the head. It is spine, spine of 5, clavicle, head. So that's probably where we want it. So we're going to do that and we'll see what happens. So we'll type in head. And you can see here we can keep relative offset, or we can snap to target, keep world scale. I'll do auto release on the pool, and we can have auto activate, at least so we can see what's going on. Now, this that we're doing here is, it's fine, but not fine, because this should be a soft reference. We need to talk about this, but for now, it's okay. So when we hit play, did you see that happened? And that's cool. Um, so obviously we don't want that to auto activate, which is ideal. Um, so we're going to move all of this here to the right, like so. And what we can do here is we can say it gives us a Niagara particle system. We can go auto activate to be off. And ideally, we will store this as a variable, saying it blink flame, which is fine. And now we need to consider, hey, can we actually rotate this in any meaningful way? So we've attached it, but it didn't look like it attached to the head itself. So we snap to target. We can try and rotate this 90 degrees and see what happens there. It might be in the Y though, but we'll see. So obviously it's not auto activating. So this is, you can see how this is a bad system, right? So ideally we want to see what's going on. So we add a Niagara system, we attach it to the mesh, and what we can do is, as you can see here, it's already rotated 90 to minus 90 because it's keeping that location. So we can do flame, and you can see that that worked immediately, and we can reset it. At least we should be able to reset it, but I guess it's not happy when we reset it. But it worked pretty well. So I think this is what we'll do here. So on the rotation, we'll do minus 89, and then it should be okay. Okay, so I've implemented it now, and I'll show you what it looks like, which I think looks pretty snazzy and pretty cool. Um, so now that we have this, and this is working quite well, let me show you. So what I've done is over here, I've made sure that the rotation is actually positive 90, and I've set the polling method to be auto release. And I've also done the auto activate off here because we don't need to do it manually. We can just do that so it doesn't start activated. And then when we blink and we have the post process being valid or not valid, we do the blink flame. We can do that before. Again, we should probably be checking if this is valid as well, but we activate with a reset, otherwise it won't work, okay? And that is basically it. I know it was a long journey, but we are here now. And obviously you can tweak this to your heart's content. I was just speeding through it, and the project files that are available are a little bit more refined than this, but obviously I spent a lot more time on those as I was developing it. And there will be a version there of this system that works with timelines instead of tick as well. So, okay. We've done it. It's all finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial series. It's not finished, but by all means, if you are just interested in building something like this in Blueprints, this is the stopping point. If you're interested in learning about performance and how to measure performance in Unreal, specifically on something that you've built, which is a really good practice and something that you would see in a day-to-day in a studio, you should look out for the next video that should be coming very, very soon. We're going to break this down. We're going to look at it and actually find how much it costs. We're going to talk about timelines versus tick. I have an example with a timeline that does exactly the same thing, and I'll show you that doing this on tick is faster. But most importantly, what I'll do is I'll show you that doing this in C++ is way faster than Blueprints anyway, which is really important to know because oftentimes when a project doesn't run well, there are things that we can do. And so the topic for the next video will be, how do we nativize a blueprint into C++, or how do we nativize only the expensive part, because you don't necessarily need to do everything in C++. Blueprints are great. I love blueprints, and you should love blueprints too. So this is it. My name is Felipe. I am a technical art director working in the games industry, and Hard Edge is my school. So if you're interested in learning more, you want to become a student, feel free to check out the links below. And as mentioned on a few times, it popped up in the video, the project files are available on my Patreon. It's really appreciated if you support the channel. We're going to be a lot more active, and you're going to see some really high quality tutorials that are very specifically geared to folks wanting to understand how things are built in the industry. So thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you for part 4. Take care, and bye for now.